Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, where war consumes entire star systems and the laughter of thirsting gods echoes through the warp, there exists a force that operates not through overwhelming firepower or demonic might, but through something far more insidious. They are ghosts that walk among both loyal and traitor alike. Warriors whose very existence is wrapped in layers upon layers of deception so complete that even asking their true allegiance is to fall into their trap. They are the 20th Legion, the last to be revealed, and perhaps the most dangerous of all. They are the Alpha Legion, and nothing about them is as it seems. Imagine for a moment that you are an Imperial commander standing on the bridge of your warship as reports flood in from across your sector. A rebellion on one world, sabotaged supply lines on another, entire regiments turning traitor seemingly overnight. You deploy your forces to contain the uprising, only to discover that the rebellion was a diversion. The real target was something else entirely, something you didn't even know was vulnerable until it was already lost. And when you finally corner what you believe to be the architect of this chaos, when you think you've captured the leader of the enemy forces, you discover that the person you've been hunting was actually 3 different individuals using the same identity. Or perhaps they were loyalists all along, and you've just destroyed the very agents who were trying to help you. This is what it means to face the Alpha Legion. To understand the Alpha Legion is to understand paradox itself. They are traitors who claim loyalty. They are Chaos Space Marines who show no signs of corruption. They are a shattered legion that operates with frightening coordination. They are servants of the dark gods who might still be following the Emperor's will. Every fact about them is contradicted by another equally valid fact. Every truth is wrapped in a lie, and every lie contains a kernel of truth. They are the living embodiment of the uncertainty principle applied to warfare, where the mere act of observing them changes what they are. The saga of the Alpha Legion is not one of glorious last stands or berserker charges into the teeth of enemy guns. It is not a tale of sorcerous might reshaping reality or the slow corruption of noble warriors into demon princes. Instead, it is a story told in whispers and shadows, out in the spaces between official records where something moved that shouldn't have been there. It is a narrative constructed from absence as much as presence, from the things that didn't happen as much as those that did. And like all the best mysteries, the more you learn about them, the less you truly understand. What follows is an attempt to chronicle the history of the Alpha Legion, though even calling it a history feels like a concession to their methods. How do you write the history of a force that rewrites history as policy? How do you trace the lineage of warriors who wear a dozen different faces and answer to 100 different names? How do you separate fact from carefully constructed fiction when the fiction was designed by superhuman intelligence specifically to be indistinguishable from fact? The answer, perhaps, is that you cannot. But in the trying, in the examination of contradictions and the analysis of shadows, we might glimpse something of the truth. Or at least we might glimpse what they want us to think is the truth. And with the Alpha Legion, that distinction might not actually matter. The Dawn of Shadows, Origins in Darkness. The story of the Alpha Legion begins, like so many things in the Imperium's history, with the Emperor of mankind himself. In the closing days of the Unification Wars, as the Emperor prepared to take his conquest beyond the skies of terror and out into the stars, he oversaw the creation of 20 legions of superhuman warriors. These would be the Space Marines, the Adeptus Astartes, the Angels of Death, who would bring the light of imperial truth to the dark corners of the galaxy. 19 of these legions were created, grown, trained, and deployed with varying degrees of public fanfare. Their numbers swelled into the tens of thousands. Their victories mounted. Their legends grew. Each legion had its character, its purpose, its place in the grand design of the Great Crusade. The first legion, the Dark Angels, were already veterans by the time most other legions were formed, having fought alongside the Emperor during the earliest campaigns of unification. The Lunar Wolves, later to be renamed the Sons of Horus, were gregarious warriors who fought with infectious enthusiasm. The Ultramarines brought order and civilization to every world they conquered, building an empire within the Imperium. The World Eaters carved through enemies with chain axes and barely controlled rage. Each legion was distinct, recognizable, their methods and character well known to those who fought alongside them or studied their campaigns. And then there was the 20th. The 20th Legion was different from its inception. So different that for decades, many in the Imperium doubted it existed at all. While other legions announced their formations with ceremonies and celebrations, while they recruited openly from specific worlds and built fortress monasteries that stood as monuments to their glory, the 20th Legion did none of these things. They emerged not with fanfare, but with absence, with gaps in records that shouldn't have been there, with operations that were attributed to no one because no one would claim them. The Alpha Legion, designated the 20th Space Marine Legion, was different from its inception. While the other legions were created in relatively clear succession, with their establishment dates and early deployment records carefully logged by the Imperialis Logistica, the 20th Legion seemed to spring into existence fully formed, yet also barely formed at all. Reports are contradictory. Some sources suggest the Legion existed in a prototype form long before it was officially recognized. Others claim it was the very last Legion created, begun only decades before the discovery of its Primarch. The truth, as with all things Alpha Legion, remains frustratingly elusive. What is known with some degree of certainty is that the Emperor created the 20th Legion alongside two others in what some sources obliquely referred to as the trefoil. These three legions, the 20th, the 18th Salamanders, and the 6th Space Wolves, were established largely in separation from the rest of the Legion as Astartes. Each seemed to have been created for a very specific purpose, though what that purpose might be remained classified at the highest levels of the imperial hierarchy. The gene seed used for these three legions was notably distinct and isolated, treated with a level of security and secrecy that exceeded even the already stringent protocols surrounding the other legions. But even among the trefoil, the 20th stood apart. While the Salamanders and Space Wolves were eventually expanded to full legion strength and deployed openly in the Great Crusade, the 20th remained limited to between 1,000 and 2,000 legionaries for an extended period. No official explanation was ever given for this restriction, as some theorists have suggested there was a flaw in the gene seed that the Emperor was attempting to rectify. Others have proposed that the Legion was deliberately kept small as a control group, a way to measure gene seed deviation and mutation against the other legions. A third theory, perhaps the most intriguing, suggests that the 20th Legion was held back to undergo additional development and conditioning unique to them, something the other legions would never receive. During this period of limited deployment, the 20th Legion operated under the designation Alpha. They had no name, no official heraldry, no recognition among the other legions or the wider Imperium. They were ghosts even then, shadows moving through the closing days of the Unification Wars and the opening salvos of the Great Crusade. Reports began to surface, fragmentary and difficult to verify, of unmarked Space Marines conducting operations far from the front lines. Abductions, assassinations, sabotage, actions taken against enemies of the Imperium that conventional forces hadn't even identified yet. These mysterious units carried little to no identifying markings. When they were forced to identify themselves to other Imperial forces, they simply invoked Alpha-level clearance codes, authorization that superseded local command structures and required no further explanation. Entire worlds would fall to rebellion and chaos, their leadership eliminated through means that were never fully explained, and only later would fragments of evidence suggest the involvement of armored warriors operating with capabilities far beyond normal humans. By the time anyone thought to investigate further, as the warriors would be gone, leaving behind only questions and corpses. The earliest recorded activities of what would become the Alpha Legion include operations that seem almost to foreshadow their later reputation. There was the incident during the 4th decade of the Great Crusade, when the gene seed reserves of the Third Legion, the Emperor's children, were nearly destroyed by a terrible viral blight. Unspecified reports of anomalous Space Marine Legion activity occurred around the same time. These actions were uniformly small-scale operations, squad to company strength, occurring far from any active war zones. The warriors involved were clearly Legiones Astartes, recognized by their power armor and capabilities, but their identity remained unknown. Some have speculated that these were test runs, evaluations of the 20th Legion's capabilities in real-world conditions. Others suggest something more sinister, that even before they were officially recognized, the Alpha units were conducting intelligence operations against other Imperial forces, gathering information that would later prove invaluable. The Emperor himself never clarified the purpose of these shadowy warriors, and those who might have known the truth took their knowledge to graves or worse fates during the dark years that followed. What drove the Emperor to create such a force in the first place remains one of the great mysteries of the Horus heresy. The Imperium had conventional intelligence services. It had the beginnings of what would become the Inquisition. It had the Officio Assassinorum for targeted elimination of threats. Why then create an entire legion of Space Marines dedicated to covert operations and unconventional warfare? What threat did the Emperor foresee that required superhuman warriors capable of moving through shadows, of operating for decades or centuries on missions that might never be acknowledged? Perhaps the answer lies in the nature of Space Marines themselves. These were not merely soldiers, but living weapons, each one a massive investment of resources and genetic engineering. They were designed to be resilient, capable of operating independently for extended periods, and possessed of intellects enhanced beyond normal human capability. For conventional warfare, for the grinding conquest of the Great Crusade, these attributes made them nearly unstoppable. But what if those same attributes were applied not to open battle but to more subtle forms of warfare? What if, instead of a hammer blow, you wanted a precisely placed blade that could strike at the heart of an enemy's infrastructure, their morale, their very ability to resist? The 20th Legion was the Emperor's answer to that question. They were the scalpel hidden behind the sledgehammer, the poison administered while everyone was watching the sword. And from the very beginning, they were meant to be secret. Not just their operations, but their very existence was information to be carefully controlled. This philosophy of secrecy as default policy would come to define everything about the Alpha Legion. From their tactics on the battlefield, to their internal organization, to their ultimate fate in the civil war that would tear the Imperium apart. By the time the Legion was officially recognized and given the designation Alpha Legion, they had already been operating in the shadows for decades. They had developed their own internal culture, their own way of warfare, their own philosophy of how superhuman warriors should be employed in the service of the Imperium. When their Primarch was finally discovered, they did not so much change as intensify. Everything they had been became more so. The shadows deepened, the deceptions multiplied, and the galaxy would never be quite certain what to make of the 20th Legion again. The gene seed of the Alpha Legion remains one of the most closely guarded secrets in Imperial records. Those fragments that even survived the heresy. Unlike other legions whose genetic inheritance was clearly traced to their Primarchs, the Alpha Legion's gene seed seemed to have been specially prepared, kept separate, treated with a level of care and security that suggested it was fundamentally different somehow. Some sources hint that this gene seed was the last strain created for the Legion's Astartes, completed only at the very end of the Unification Wars, which would explain the Legion's late founding. But it doesn't explain why that gene seed was so carefully protected, or what made it different from all the others. The security protocols surrounding the Alpha Legion's gene seed were extraordinary even by the standards of the Legion's Astartes project. Access to the gene seed vaults required clearance from the Emperor himself, and not merely from the various tech priests and apothecaries who normally handled such materials. The genetic templates were kept in locations that were never disclosed to the wider Imperialis Logistica. Even the Primarchs of other legions, who might reasonably have had access to such information for coordination purposes, were denied knowledge of where the Alpha Legion's gene seed was stored or how it was processed. This level of secrecy has led to endless speculation about what made the Alpha Legion's genetic inheritance unique. Some have suggested that it incorporated elements that were experimental, even by the standards of the Emperor's genetic engineering. Perhaps modifications intended to enhance cognitive capabilities at the expense of raw physical power, and creating Astartes who were more intelligent tacticians rather than pure warriors. Others have proposed that the gene seed was designed to be more stable, less prone to mutation, specifically so that the Legion could operate in environments where mutation and corruption were constant threats. The most intriguing theory, though, is that the Alpha Legion's gene seed was created as a template for something else entirely. There is fragmentary evidence suggesting that the development of the Legio Custodes, the Emperor's personal guard of transhuman protectors, drew upon research conducted during the creation of the 20th Legion. If true, this would mean that the Alpha Legion was never meant to be merely another Space Marine Legion, but rather a stepping stone towards something greater, or a proof of concept for enhancements that would be refined and perfected in the creation of the Custodian Guard. One of the most notable anomalies that would later emerge was the near-identical appearance of Alpha Legion members. Whether this was an intentional feature of their gene seed or the result of deliberate genetic manipulation, Alpha Legionaries bore a striking resemblance to each other and to their Primarch. This uniformity of appearance was not absolute. There were variations in height, build, and features, but the similarities were striking enough that observers often commented on them. Brothers from the Alpha Legion could pass for each other with minimal preparation, requiring only the exchange of armor and the adoption of mannerisms. This would prove to be an enormous tactical advantage, allowing the Legion to engage in deception on a scale that other legions could never match. Consider the implications from an enemy's perspective. You identify a target, let's say a captain of the Alpha Legion, who commands a critical operation. You track this captain, learning his patterns, his habits, his relationships with other members of the Legion. You plan an assassination, execute it flawlessly, and confirm the kill. And then, within hours, the same captain appears somewhere else, issuing orders, continuing operations as if nothing had happened. Was the first kill a failure? Did you kill someone else by mistake? Or is the captain simply a role that multiple Alpha Legionaries are trained to fulfill, any one of them capable of assuming the identity at a moment's notice? Yet this physical similarity also had deeper implications for the Legion's psychology and culture. In most Space Marine legions, individual warriors maintained some sense of personal identity, even within the brotherhood of their chapter. They had names that were theirs alone, honors that distinguished them, personal histories that made each warrior unique, even as they all served the same cause. The Dark Angels remembered which order they had belonged to before their conversion to Astartes. The Space Wolves carried memories of their tribal affiliations from Fenris. Each warrior was an individual who had chosen to subsume that individuality into service to the Legion. But when everyone looks the same, when personal identity becomes something that can be assumed or discarded as easily as changing armor, the very concept of individual identity begins to blur. You are not just a member of the Alpha Legion. You are the Alpha Legion. Your identity is not separate from the whole, but part of it, and the whole is infinitely adaptable, infinitely replaceable. This created a form of collective consciousness that went beyond mere brotherhood. Alpha Legionaries didn't just fight for each other. They were each other, in a very real and practical sense. This would lead to one of the Alpha Legion's most famous and frustrating practices. When dealing with outsiders, Alpha Legionaries would often introduce themselves as Alpharius, or simply as one of many. This wasn't mere arrogance or an attempt to confuse, though it certainly achieved that effect. It was a fundamental expression of how the Legion saw itself. There was no meaningful distinction between individual members, because the mission was always larger than any individual. To kill one Alpha Legionary meant nothing, because there were always others who could assume that role, take up that mission, continue that operation. The Hydra's many heads were not a metaphor. They were operational doctrine made flesh. The psychological impact of this approach on other Imperial forces was profound and often deeply unsettling. Imagine serving alongside warriors who refuse to acknowledge their own distinct identities, who seem to view themselves as interchangeable components of a larger machine. It created a kind of uncanny valley effect, where these were clearly space marines, clearly superhuman warriors, who should have had the same fierce individual pride that characterized Astartes everywhere, but who instead presented themselves as a collective entity. It made building trust difficult. How do you form a bond with a warrior who might not be the same individual you fought beside yesterday? How do you learn to predict someone's actions when the person executing those actions might be completely different from one day to the next? Recruitment for the Alpha Legion was as mysterious as every other aspect of their operations. Most Space Marine legions recruited from specific worlds, places that provided aspirants with particular characteristics that suited that legion's methods. The Space Wolves recruited from the feral tribes of Fenris. The Blood Angels drew from the artistic and violent culture of Baal. The Ultramarines had hundreds of worlds in Ultramar that provided a steady stream of recruits, shaped by the civilization Reboot Gilliman had built. The Alpha Legion, characteristically, had no known homeworld. Alpharius never claimed any particular world as his point of origin, and the Legion never established a central recruiting world that other legions could identify. Instead, they seemed to draw recruits from wherever they operated, taking aspirants from dozens or hundreds of different worlds across the galaxy. This distributed recruitment model had several advantages. It meant the Legion wasn't dependent on any single world for its survival. If their recruitment source had been known, enemy forces could have targeted it, potentially crippling the Legion's ability to replace losses. By recruiting from multiple sources, they ensured resilience against such attacks. But distributed recruitment also created challenges. Different worlds produced aspirants with different cultural backgrounds, different languages, different baseline assumptions about how society functioned. Creating unity among such diverse recruits required extensive psychological conditioning and cultural indoctrination. The Alpha Legion apparently had methods for achieving this, for taking recruits from wildly different backgrounds and molding them into warriors who all thought and operated in the same way. But those methods were never shared with other legions or recorded in any documents that survived the heresy. There were rumors, never confirmed but persistent enough to suggest some truth. That the Alpha Legion didn't merely recruit promising youths and transform them into Space Marines. They were said to have programs for identifying individuals in their teens or early 20s who showed particular aptitudes for intelligence work, deception, or strategic thinking. These individuals would be tracked, sometimes for years, their capabilities assessed through tests they didn't know they were taking. Those who proved sufficiently promising would then be approached, offered the chance to serve the Imperium in ways that went beyond conventional military service. Some of these recruits apparently never became full Astartes. Instead, they were enhanced with lesser genetic modifications, given advanced training, and deployed as deep cover operatives who could pass as normal humans. They retained their original identities, continued their previous lives, but now served as eyes and ears for the Alpha Legion, reporting on threats and opportunities that might not be visible to conventional intelligence gathering. This network of semi-enhanced operatives existed in parallel with the Legion proper, providing a capability that no other Legion possessed: the ability to maintain awareness across vast distances and diverse populations without requiring the presence of easily identifiable Space Marines. The twin Primarchs, children of deception. If the Alpha Legion's origins are shrouded in mystery, then the story of their Primarch, or rather Primarchs, exists in a realm beyond mere mystery, approaching something closer to deliberate mythology. The tale of Alpharius Omegon is perhaps the most contested, contradictory, and deliberately obscured narrative in all the chronicles of the Horus Heresy. And given that we're talking about an event that saw half the Emperor's sons turn traitor and plunge the galaxy into civil war, that's saying something. According to the most widely circulated account, torn from the mind of an Alpha Legion centurion, captured by the Legio Custodes after the fall of the Seraphim, the Primarch who would come to lead the 20th Legion was found on a nameless dead world at the edge of the Mandragoran stars. This world civilization had risen and fallen long before humanity first walked on Terra, leaving behind ruins that spoke of glories and horrors in equal measure. What happened to the infant Primarch in this desolate place? How he survived? What shaped his growth and development? The account does not specify. But the implication is clear that Alfarius grew up surrounded by the ghosts of a dead civilization, learning lessons from ruins and echoes rather than living teachers. Another account, one that circulated secretly between houses and factions of the imperial court on Terra, tells a different story entirely. This version claims that Alfarius was discovered not by the emperor directly, but by Horus Lupercal, the first Primarch found and the emperor's favorite son. The story goes that Horus and his lunar wolves were conducting operations in the region when they encountered a mysterious fleet engaging enemy forces with tactics and precision that seemed almost familiar. When Horus went to investigate personally, he was attacked by what appeared to be a skilled warrior in advanced armor. But Horus did not slay this attacker. Instead, he recognized in the warrior's face, in his movements, in some ineffable quality, a brother. The new arrival called himself Alfarius and claimed to have been traveling through the region of space for many years. But when pressed about his origins, about where he had come from and which world had raised him, Alfarius remained frustratingly vague. Various worlds in that locale were subsequently brought into the imperial fold, brought into compliance with remarkably little bloodshed, but Alfarius denied that any of them were his homeworld. The conglomeration of planets he had been leading, orchestrating their actions with a skill that suggested long practice, joined the Imperium willingly. They seemed to have been waiting for this moment, prepared for it, as if their loyalty had never really been in question. A third version appears in fragments from various sources, suggesting that Alfarius was actually found much earlier than any official records indicate. Some whisper that he never left Terra at all, that when the infant Primarchs were scattered across the galaxy by the machinations of the Chaos Gods, Alfarius somehow made it no further than the Imperial Palace's outer walls. According to this account, the Emperor found him almost immediately and kept his existence secret for reasons known only to himself. Alfarius was supposedly raised in the shadows of the palace, trained personally by the Emperor in arts of strategy and subterfuge that went far beyond the military education given to other Primarchs. This version would explain a great deal about Alfarius's character and capabilities, and it would explain why he seemed to possess such intimate knowledge of the Imperium's inner workings, why his tactical approach was so different from his brothers who had grown up on barbaric or technologically primitive worlds. It would explain why the 20th Legion was kept small and secret for so long, operating without a Primarch because their Primarch was still in training, still being prepared for a role that required not just military genius, but a very specific kind of duplicitous brilliance. And then there is the greatest secret of all, the truth that even other Primarchs did not know. Alfarius was not alone. The 20th Legion had not one Primarch, but two. Alfarius Omegon, the twin Primarchs, two souls in two bodies that were absolutely identical in appearance. Or whether the Emperor designed this intentionally, or whether it was an accident of the Primarch creation process, remains unknown. What is certain is that the existence of Omegon was kept hidden from all but the Alpha Legion itself. The implications of this twin Primarch arrangement are staggering. For one thing, it meant that Alfarius could be in two places at once, or more precisely, that reports of Alfarius's presence in multiple locations simultaneously might not be deception at all, but simple fact. It meant that killing Alfarius, if you somehow managed such a feat, might accomplish nothing because Omegon could simply assume the role. It meant that even the Primarch identity itself was fungible, mutable, a role that could be played by more than one being. And some accounts suggest that Alfarius and Omegan shared more than just identical appearance. They supposedly shared a single soul split between two bodies, could communicate without words, felt what the other felt, thought what the other thought. If true, this would make them something unique even among Primarchs, each of whom was already a unique miracle of genetic engineering and warpcraft. But it would also create a relationship of such intimacy and coordination that their plans could operate on a level of complexity and synchronization impossible for other commanders. The relationship between Alfarius and Omegan themselves seems to have been complicated in ways that outsiders could never fully understand. They presented themselves as unified, as two halves of a perfect whole, but evidence suggests that they sometimes disagreed. As that Omegan might have been more pragmatic, where Alfarius was more idealistic, or vice versa. During the Horus Heresy, there are accounts of actions taken by Alpha Legion forces that seem to contradict other actions, as if the Legion was operating at cross purposes with itself. Some have speculated that this represented a genuine split between the twin Primarchs, each following their own interpretation of the Cabal's prophecy, each pursuing their own path to what they believed would be the Emperor's ultimate victory. When Alfarius was finally, officially, revealed to the Emperor and the Imperium at large, the reunion was reportedly brief and formal. Unlike other Primarchs who spent extended time with their father, learning from him and being prepared for their role, that Alfarius was given command of his legion and sent out almost immediately. This was late in the Great Crusade, possibly the very last Primarch to be officially acknowledged, which meant the 20th Legion was also the last to receive its Primarch. For most legions, the discovery of their Primarch was a transformative moment, but for the Alpha Legion, it seemed to be more of a confirmation of what they already were. Alfarius brought with him, or perhaps the Legion had already developed under his distant guidance, a very specific philosophy of warfare. He believed in the principle that every problem had multiple solutions, and the optimal approach was to pursue all of them simultaneously. He advocated for coordination between disparate elements, for plans within plans, and for operations that created opportunities regardless of how the enemy responded. Where other Primarchs might develop a single battle plan with contingencies, Alfarius developed a dozen overlapping plans that all worked toward the same goal through different means.
You know, I've been researching Warhammer lore for quite a while, and the Alpha Legion's choice with the Cabal still keeps me up at night. Think about it. They were basically told choose between two apocalypses, and they had to make that decision knowing billions of lives hung in the balance. Were they naive to trust Xeno's prophecy? Absolutely. But I can't help wondering what I would have done in their position. It's easy to say they should have rejected the Cabal outright, but when you're staring at the potential end of everything you fought for, certainty becomes a luxury you can't afford. That's what makes them so fascinating to me. They're not just traitors or secret loyalists. They're the embodiment of impossible choices and the weight those choices carry across millennia. It's the kind of moral complexity that makes 40k so much richer than simple good versus evil. But yeah, let's continue the lore.
This approach required an enormous investment in intelligence gathering and preparation. The Alpha Legion would spend weeks, months, sometimes even years, preparing the battlefield before the actual fighting began. They would infiltrate human operatives into enemy territory, individuals who were not Astartes, but were loyal to the Imperium and could pass unnoticed among the local population. These operatives would map out infrastructure, identify key figures, establish supply networks, and create the conditions for the Alpha Legion's arrival to be not the beginning of a battle, but the final stroke in a war the enemy didn't realize they were already losing. This methodology won battles. There was no question about that. Worlds that might have required years of grinding warfare to conquer fell in days or weeks to Alpha Legion operations. Entire rebellions were snuffed out before they could truly begin, their leaders eliminated and their resources seized before they could mount any meaningful resistance. but it also created friction with other Primarchs and other legions who didn't understand or appreciate these methods. Roboute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines and the Great Crusade's most prolific conqueror, clashed with Alfarius repeatedly over methodology. Guilliman believed in efficient, an overwhelming force applied according to established doctrine. His approach was to perfect the art of conventional warfare to such a degree that victory became inevitable. Alfarius's methods, by contrast, seemed baroque and needlessly complicated to Guilliman's practical mind. Why spend months on an elaborate campaign of infiltration and sabotage when you could simply drop a crusade-strength force on a planet and conquer it in a week of hard fighting? The most famous clash between their philosophies came during the compliance of Testra Prime. The planet's capital could have been taken through direct assault with relatively light casualties. Guilliman, who was overseeing the operation, expected the Alpha Legion to do exactly that. Instead, Alfarius refused to take the straightforward approach. He allowed the defenders to fortify their positions, to commit to a defense of the capital, and then, over the course of a week, he dismantled their ability to fight through a combination of sabotage, infiltration, and psychological operations. By the time the final assault came, the defenders had suffered 90% casualties without the Alpha Legion having committed to a single major engagement. When Guilliman confronted Alfarius about why he had chosen such a complicated approach when a simple assault would have sufficed, Alfarius reportedly replied that it would have been too easy. This response encapsulates something fundamental about the Alpha Legion's character. They weren't just trying to win, they were trying to prove that their way of war was superior, that the complex and subtle approach was more effective than conventional operations. Every campaign became an opportunity to demonstrate their methods, to show other legions that there was more than one way to serve the Emperor's will. Rogal Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, was even more critical of the Alpha Legion's methods. Dorn was a fortress builder, a master of siege warfare and defensive operations. He thought in terms of clear objectives, defensible positions, and plans that could withstand contact with the enemy because they were built on solid foundations. The Alpha Legion's approach, with its multiple overlapping strategies and deliberately maintained ambiguity, struck him as fundamentally unsound. What happened when the enemy did something completely unexpected, and all those carefully laid plans fell apart? And Dorn didn't trust that the Alpha Legion could adapt, and he didn't appreciate the unintended consequences that their operations sometimes created. Only Horus Lupercal, the War Master, consistently praised Alfarius and his legion. Horus understood the value of having forces capable of operating in ways that other legions could not. He appreciated the intelligence that the Alpha Legion's operations generated, the opportunities they created for other forces to exploit. And perhaps most importantly, Horus and Alfarius seemed to share a certain pragmatic flexibility that other Primarchs lacked. They were willing to do what was necessary to achieve victory, even if those methods were unpalatable to more straightforward warriors like Dorn or Guilliman. This relationship between Horus and Alfarius would prove to be crucial when the galaxy began its descent into civil war. Of all his brother Primarchs, Alfarius knew and trusted only Horus. He had been found by Horus, or claimed to have been. He had campaigned alongside Horus. He had received praise and recognition from Horus when other Primarchs offered only criticism. So when Horus began his rebellion, when the War Master turned traitor and sought to overthrow the Emperor, it perhaps should not have been surprising that Alfarius followed. But as with everything involving the Alpha Legion, even this betrayal was not quite what it seemed. Masters of deception, the art of war, perfected during the height of the Great Crusade, before the galaxy descended into the nightmare of the Horus heresy, the Alpha Legion developed and refined tactics that would become their signature. These were not merely battle plans or strategic concepts, but an entire philosophy of warfare that operated on fundamentally different principles than the approaches used by other Space Marine legions. Where the World Eaters sought to close with the enemy and destroy them in savage melee, where the Imperial Fists built impenetrable defenses and then ground down attackers through superior position and firepower, The Alpha Legion sought to win wars before battles were even fought. The centerpiece of the Alpha Legion's tactical doctrine was something they called the harrowing. This was not a single tactic, but rather a comprehensive operational framework that could be adapted to virtually any situation. The core principle was devastatingly simple. Before you engage the enemy in open battle, you undermine everything that allows them to fight. You eliminate their leadership through targeted strikes. You sabotage their supply lines so their troops go hungry and their vehicles run out of fuel. You infiltrate their communications networks and feed them false information until they cannot trust their own intelligence. You turn their population against them through propaganda and subversion until every civilian is a potential spy or saboteur. You create internal divisions and exploit them until the enemy is fighting themselves as much as they are fighting you. Only when all of this groundwork was complete, when the enemy was weakened to the point of near collapse, or only then would the Alpha Legion reveal themselves fully and conduct what they called the final harrowing. This was a devastating assault from multiple directions simultaneously, an overwhelming application of force at the point where the enemy was most vulnerable. But by this time, the outcome was already decided. The battle was merely the final act of a play that had been in progress for weeks or months. The genius of this approach was that it allowed a relatively small force to achieve results far beyond what conventional tactics would suggest possible. The Alpha Legion never numbered among the largest of the Space Marine legions. Even at their height, they were probably in the middle range in terms of actual Astartes numbers. But through the use of human operatives, through careful preparation and intelligence work, through the multiplication of force that came from striking at the right moment in the right way, they could accomplish what much larger legions could not. These human operatives deserve special attention because they were central to how the Alpha Legion operated. Unlike other Space Marine legions, which might occasionally make use of Imperial army forces or local militia, the Alpha Legion systematically cultivated networks of non-Astartes agents across the territories they operated in. These were not mere informants or scouts, but carefully recruited specialists who underwent significant training and were often augmented with genetic or cybernetic enhancements that brought their capabilities closer to those of Space Marines themselves. An Alpha Legion operative might be a merchant who had been recruited years ago and placed in a key position in an enemy's supply network. They might be a military officer in a planetary defense force, someone who had been identified as sympathetic to the Imperium's goals and carefully cultivated over the course of multiple campaigns. They might even be members of rebel groups, individuals who thought they were working against the Imperium, but were actually being manipulated toward ends they couldn't perceive. The Alpha Legion's agent networks extended tendrils throughout the territories they operated in, creating a web of intelligence and capability that most enemies never even knew existed. When the moment came for action, these operatives would be activated through various means. Sometimes it was a simple coded message, or at other times a more elaborate signal that indicated it was time to carry out their assigned tasks. And then, across an entire planet, or even an entire system, infrastructure would begin to fail in ways that seemed random but were actually precisely coordinated. Power plants would suffer mysterious technical failures. Communication relays would go offline. Food supplies would be contaminated. Military command posts would be destroyed by individuals who had worked in those facilities for years, waiting for this moment. The effect on enemy morale was often more devastating than actual casualties. When your soldiers cannot trust their equipment, when their leaders are being assassinated by their own staff, when even civilians seem to be working against them, the psychological impact is enormous. Discipline breaks down, the units stop following orders. The entire military structure begins to collapse from within, and this was all before the first Alpha Legionary fired a shot in anger. The Alpha Legion's approach to intelligence gathering was similarly comprehensive. They didn't just want to know the enemy's order of battle or the layout of their defenses. They wanted to know everything. The personalities of enemy commanders, and which of those commanders had the influence to actually make decisions. the cultural and political divisions within the enemy population, and how those could be exploited, the infrastructure dependencies and which nodes were single points of failure, the communication protocols and how they could be intercepted or spoofed. The Alpha Legion approached warfare as a problem to be solved through information, and they believed that with sufficient information, any enemy could be defeated. This obsession with information gathering and operational security applied to their own forces as well. The Alpha Legion went to extraordinary lengths to prevent their enemies, and even their allies, from knowing anything concrete about their strength, disposition, or intentions. Before the Horus heresy, even the Imperialis Logistica, the vast bureaucratic apparatus responsible for tracking and supplying the Legiones Astartes, could not provide reliable estimates of the Alpha Legion's strength. Reports varied wildly. Some suggested the Legion numbered perhaps 50,000 Astartes. Others indicated it might be significantly smaller. A few fragmentary sources hinted that the Legion might actually be far larger than anyone suspected, potentially rivaling the largest legions in size. This uncertainty was deliberate. The Alpha Legion maintained multiple separate fleet elements that appeared to operate independently, rarely, if ever, gathering together in one place. They had multiple recruiting worlds that were never publicly acknowledged. They operated extensive facilities in regions of space that were nominally under Imperial control, but were remote enough that oversight was minimal. They deliberately submitted incomplete or misleading reports to Imperial authorities. The result was that the Alpha Legion's true strength was one of the most closely guarded secrets in the Imperium, known only to the Legion itself, and perhaps not even fully known to all elements of the Legion. The practice of adopting shared identities extended beyond battlefield deception and became a core part of how the Legion functioned. Multiple Alpha Legionaries might use the same name and identity, even in official records. When one was killed, another would simply assume that identity, maintaining continuity of command and making it impossible for enemies to track individual leaders. This created a situation where targeting Alpha Legion leadership was nearly futile because killing one captain or commander meant nothing. The identity, the role, the mission, all of it would simply transfer to another warrior who would pick up exactly where the first had left off. Some of the most impressive Alpha Legion operations during the Great Crusade involved levels of complexity that bordered on obsessive. But the campaign on Testra Prime was hardly the only example. On multiple worlds, the Alpha Legion would orchestrate scenarios where they appeared to fail, would allow enemy forces to achieve apparent victories, all as part of larger strategic manipulations. They would sometimes operate in the colors and heraldry of other legions, carrying out missions that those legions would later be credited with or blamed for. They would create false intelligence that would lead enemies into traps, not of Alpha Legion design, but of their own misunderstanding of the situation. This last point is worth dwelling on. The Alpha Legion didn't always need to directly defeat their enemies. Sometimes it was enough to manipulate the situation so that the enemy defeated themselves. As they would feed false intelligence to an enemy commander, suggesting that a particular location was lightly defended when it was actually a death trap. They would create the appearance of internal dissent within Imperial forces, causing the enemy to waste time and resources preparing for threats that didn't exist. They would assassinate key individuals in ways that made it look like factional infighting, turning enemy groups against each other. However, this elaborate and increasingly complex approach to warfare began to concern some observers even before the heresy. There were suggestions that the Alpha Legion had begun to seek out challenges for their own sake, that they were orchestrating complicated operations not because they were the most effective approach, but because they wanted to demonstrate their capability. The Testra Prime campaign was a perfect example. A straightforward assault would have been faster, cheaper in terms of resources, and would have achieved the same strategic objective. But Alfarius chose the complicated approach specifically because it was more difficult, as if the challenge itself was the point. This tendency raised questions about the Alpha Legion's ultimate reliability. Were they executing the most effective operations in service of the Emperor's Great Crusade? Or were they using the Great Crusade as an opportunity to prove their own superiority. When they operated with such secrecy that even Imperial High Command couldn't reliably track what they were doing, how could anyone be certain they were serving the Imperium's interests? These concerns remained largely unspoken during the Great Crusade, but they created an undercurrent of distrust that would have significant consequences when the galaxy went to war with itself. The Alpha Legion's preferred targets during their operations revealed much about their philosophy. They focused on what they called critical nodes, the points in any system that, if removed or compromised, would cause cascading failures throughout the rest of the structure. This might be a planetary governor whose death would create a succession crisis. It might be a water treatment facility whose destruction would make a hive city uninhabitable. It might be a single tech priest who held irreplaceable knowledge about maintaining critical infrastructure. The Alpha Legion was expert at identifying these critical nodes and then removing them at the precise moment that would create maximum disruption. This approach required extraordinary patience and discipline. Alpha Legion operations might take months or even years to come to fruition. Agents would be placed in position, information would be gathered, plans would be refined, all while the Legion maintained other active operations elsewhere. The ability to manage multiple simultaneous operations across vast distances, each operating on different timescales and toward different intermediate objectives, but all contributing to overarching strategic goals, was perhaps the Alpha Legion's greatest achievement. It was a form of warfare that no other legion could replicate because it required not just military skill, but an entirely different mindset, a willingness to see warfare as a long-term investment rather than a series of distinct campaigns. But excellence in unconventional warfare came with costs. The Alpha Legion's relationships with other legions ranged from strained to openly hostile. The Death Guard, who favored direct grinding warfare of attrition, considered the Alpha Legion's methods cowardly. The Imperial Fists, as mentioned, found their operational security obsessive to the point of paranoia. The Thousand Sons, despite their own secretive nature, seemed to actively avoid working with the Alpha Legion for reasons that were never made clear. Even the Ultramarines, who should have appreciated the Alpha Legion's focus on efficiency and results, found their methods distasteful and unnecessarily risky. Only the Lunar Wolves, and later the Sons of Horus, maintained consistently good relations with the Alpha Legion. This was partly due to Horus's personal relationship with Alpharius, but it was also because Horus understood the value of having forces capable of operations that other legions could not perform. When the War Master needed intelligence gathered, when he needed an enemy compromised before the main assault, when he needed an operation that required deniability, he turned to the Alpha Legion, and they delivered results with a reliability that overcame any concerns about their methods. As the Great Crusade progressed and began to wind down, the Alpha Legion found itself operating increasingly on the fringes of Imperial space. They were deployed to deal with backsliding worlds, human civilizations that had accepted Imperial rule during the Crusade, but were now showing signs of rebellion or heresy. They conducted operations against threats that weren't significant enough to require full Crusade attention, but couldn't be left to fester. They worked in the empty spaces between the Imperium's major holdings, the regions that were nominally Imperial, but where actual control was tenuous at best. This peripheral deployment served the Legion well. It gave them even more freedom to operate as they saw fit, unencumbered by oversight from other Imperial forces. It allowed them to expand their agent networks into regions where no one else was paying much attention, and it positioned them perfectly for what would come next, the galactic civil war that would consume the Imperium and redefine the fate of humanity. Whether this positioning was intentional, and whether Alpharius somehow foresaw the heresy and maneuvered his legion into optimal position for it, or whether it was simply fortunate circumstance, remains another of the many mysteries surrounding the 20th Legion. The Cabal and the Choice, a prophecy of damnation. The year was approximately 800 3.M30, roughly 2 years before the outbreak of the Horus heresy, though the significance of that timing would only become clear in retrospect. The Alpha Legion was conducting an Imperial compliance operation on a world called Nerth, a planet inhabited by a Xenos species that had refused to accept Imperial rule. It should have been a straightforward operation, the kind the Alpha Legion had executed countless times before: infiltrate, undermine, conquer. But this compliance would become one of the most pivotal moments, not just in the Alpha Legion's history, but potentially in the fate of the entire galaxy. The campaign on Nerth had been proceeding according to Alpha Legion doctrine. Human auxiliary forces, the Imperial Army, were conducting the surface operations, while Alpha Legion operatives worked in the shadows to compromise the Xenos civilization's ability to resist. But the Nerthine proved to be more than they appeared. These Xenos had knowledge of the warp, of the entities that dwelt within it, and they possessed precognitive abilities that made them difficult to manipulate through conventional means. The campaign dragged on longer than anticipated, and it was during this extended operation that the Alpha Legion was contacted by an entity they had no reason to expect, an agent of a group calling themselves the Cabal. The agent's name was John Grammaticus, and he was something called a perpetual, a human who could not permanently die, who had lived for thousands of years and would live for thousands more. He carried with him a message of such importance, such cosmic significance, that even the secretive and skeptical Alpha Legion could not ignore it. The Cabal, he claimed, was a group of ancient Xenos species who had been fighting the forces of chaos, the entities in the warp that humans called demons or gods, for longer than human civilization had existed. And they had seen the future. They knew what was coming. The galaxy stood at a crossroads, and the choice of which path to take would fall, impossibly, to the Alpha Legion. Alpharius and Omegon agreed to meet with the Cabal on a remote world designated 42 Hydra Tertius. This in itself was remarkable. The Alpha Legion's Primarchs did not typically agree to meetings with unknown entities, did not place themselves in potentially vulnerable situations without extensive preparation and contingencies. But something about the Cabal's message had resonated, had convinced them that this was worth the risk. Perhaps it was the Cabal's demonstrated knowledge of events that should have been impossible for them to know. Perhaps it was the evidence they provided of their long war against chaos, a war that the Emperor himself was fighting, though from a very different angle. Whatever the reason, the meeting took place. What the Cabal showed the twin Primarchs would haunt them for the rest of their existence. Through means that combined warpcraft and technology, the Cabal presented visions of the future. Not one future, but two possible futures. Two divergent paths that flowed from a single decision point that was fast approaching. They showed Horus Lupercal, the beloved War Master, the Emperor's favored son, standing at the precipice of a choice that would determine the fate of humanity. And they showed what would follow from that choice. The first vision was of what would happen if the Emperor prevailed in the coming war. This was presented as the obvious path, the one that any loyal servant of the Imperium would prefer. The Emperor would defeat Horus, the rebellion would be crushed, and the Imperium would endure. But the victory would be Pyrrhic. What the Emperor would be mortally wounded in the final confrontation, unable to die, but unable to truly live, bound to the Golden Throne on Terra as a howling consciousness trapped in a decaying body. The Imperium would survive, yes, but it would be a slow death. Over 10,000, perhaps 20,000 years, the Imperium would decay from within. Its corruption, both metaphorical and literal, would spread. The influence of chaos would grow. Humanity would become a tool of the dark gods without even realizing it. Their devotion to the God Emperor, feeding the very entities they sought to resist. And in the end, the galaxy would be consumed by chaos, utterly and completely. The second vision was darker still, at least in the short term. This was the future where Horus triumphed, where the War Master succeeded in killing the Emperor and claiming rulership of the Imperium. The immediate aftermath would be catastrophic. Horus, victorious but racked with guilt and self-loathing for having slain his father, would turn on his own followers. The unity that had briefly held the traitor forces together would shatter. Horus would become a destroyer, laying waste to his own empire in an orgy of self-destructive violence. Within 2 or 3 generations, all of humanity would be dead, exterminated either by Horus's madness or by the predations of Xenos species, who would take advantage of humanity's collapse. It would be extinction, quick and total. But, the Cabal explained, in that extinction lay salvation for the rest of the galaxy. The Chaos Gods fed on emotion, on the psychic resonance of living, feeling beings. They had grown strong on humanity's emotions, on the vast populations of the Imperium, generating fear and hate and ambition and despair on a scale that few species in the galaxy's history had ever achieved. But if humanity went extinct, if those trillions of souls were suddenly silenced, the Chaos Gods would be starved. Without the sustenance provided by human emotion, without the worship and devotion and terror that fueled them, the Chaos Gods would weaken and eventually fade. They might not die. Entities like that might be incapable of true death, but they would cease to be the dominant threat to the galaxy. Other species would survive. The galaxy would be saved. All it required was the complete annihilation of humanity. This was the choice the Cabal presented to Alfarius and Omegon. Support the Emperor, serve loyally, and ensure humanity's long, agonizing decay into a tool of chaos. Or support Horus, aid in the Emperor's murder, and ensure humanity's quick extinction, but the galaxy's salvation. There was no third option, the Cabal insisted. These were the only 2 futures their precognition could see, and the decision point was rapidly approaching. The Alpha Legion had to choose. The moral calculus of this choice is almost incomprehensible. For a space marine, a being created specifically to serve and protect humanity, to be told that the only way to serve a greater good was to ensure humanity's extinction, it was a contradiction that struck at the very core of their purpose. Everything the Alpha Legion had done, every operation they had conducted, every enemy they had defeated, it had all been in service of humanity's survival and expansion. And now they were being told that continuing that service would doom the galaxy. But the Alpha Legion was not like other Space Marine legions. They were trained to think in terms of complex strategies and non-obvious solutions. They were accustomed to scenarios where the obvious choice was wrong and the counterintuitive approach was correct. And they were capable of the kind of ruthless pragmatism that could countenance terrible costs in pursuit of greater objectives. If the Cabal was correct, if these really were the only 2 options, then from a purely logical standpoint, the choice was clear. 2 or 3 generations of humanity suffering extinction was tragic, but 10 or 20,000 years of decay leading to the entire galaxy being consumed by chaos was infinitely worse. Why, there is an account of what the twin Primarchs said when confronted with this impossible choice. Both Alfarius and Omegon reportedly staggered back from the vision, their superhuman composure shattered by the magnitude of what they had been shown. And then they spoke, their voices unified in a declaration that would define everything that followed. The Alpha Legion has always, always been for the Emperor. This statement is crucial because it reveals the fundamental logic by which Alfarius and Omegon made their decision. They did not choose to support Horus out of resentment or ambition or corruption by chaos. They chose to support Horus because they believed, based on the Cabal's prophecy, that this was what the Emperor would want. The Emperor's ultimate goal was the destruction of chaos, the elimination of its threat to humanity. If the only way to achieve that goal was through humanity's extinction, then that was the price that had to be paid. It was the ultimate expression of loyalty, to sacrifice everything, even the very thing you were created to protect, because that sacrifice served a greater purpose. But this logic created an impossible paradox. To be loyal to the Emperor, the Alpha Legion would have to betray him. To serve his ultimate goals, they would have to oppose his immediate interests. They would have to do everything in their power to ensure Horus's victory, knowing that this victory meant the death of the Emperor and the extinction of humanity. And they would have to do this while maintaining the appearance of serving Horus and Chaos, ensuring that their true loyalties were never suspected by either side. Or because if anyone discovered what they were really trying to accomplish, the whole plan would fall apart. The Cabal also revealed something else during this meeting, something that explained why they had approached the Alpha Legion specifically. They had studied the Primarchs, had watched them from afar since before they were even created, and they had determined that the most important Primarchs were the oldest and the youngest, Horus and Alpharius. What Horus would do, Alpharius would undo. What Horus would begin, Alpharius would end. The Alpha Legion was perfectly positioned, both in terms of their capabilities and their relationship with Horus, to influence the course of the heresy. They could ensure it went one way or the other. The fate of the galaxy rested, improbably, on the choice of the 20th Legion. Thus, accepting the Cabal's prophecy required an enormous leap of faith. The Alpha Legion had no way to verify the Cabal's predictions. They had no way to know if these Xenos were sincere, or if this was some elaborate deception designed to corrupt another Space Marine Legion. They couldn't even be certain that the Cabal's precognition was accurate, that these really were the only two possible futures. But the alternative was to reject the prophecy, to assume that they could fight against Horus, help defeat the rebellion, and somehow avoid the 10,000-year decay into a chaos-corrupted nightmare that the Cabal had shown them. And that felt like wishful thinking, like hoping for a third option that didn't exist. So they made their choice. They would support Horus. They would aid in the rebellion. Or they would do everything necessary to ensure that the War Master succeeded in his overthrow of the Emperor. Not because they had turned traitor, not because chaos had corrupted them, but because they believed this was the only way to ultimately defeat chaos. They would betray the Emperor to serve the Emperor's goals. They would damn themselves to save the galaxy. It was, in its own twisted way, perhaps the most loyal thing any Primarch had ever done. And it was also, perhaps, the greatest tragedy of the entire Horus heresy. But even as they made this choice, questions lingered. Did Alpharius and Omegon truly believe the Cabal's prophecy? Or did they see it as a convenient justification for actions they wanted to take anyway? Did they both agree with the decision? Or was there disagreement between the twins that they hid from the Cabal and from their own legion? And perhaps most importantly, once they had made this choice, were they locked into it? Or did they continue to question, to doubt, to search for that elusive third option that the Cabal insisted did not exist? The answers to these questions would become evident only in the actions the Alpha Legion took during the heresy itself. And even then, those actions would be so contradictory, so deliberately confusing, that certainty would remain impossible. The heresy, between loyalty and treason. When war finally came to the Imperium, when Horus Lupercal revealed his treachery and called upon those legions loyal to him to cast down the Emperor, the Alpha Legion was ready. They had been preparing for this moment for 2 years, and ever since their meeting with the Cabal, ever since they had made the impossible choice to support Horus in order to serve the Emperor's ultimate goals. But being prepared did not make what followed any easier, did not lessen the horror of what they would have to do. To ensure Horus's victory meant ensuring the Emperor's defeat, and that meant fighting against and killing other Space Marines, their brothers in all but name. The planning that went into the Alpha Legion's role in the heresy must have begun immediately after their meeting with the Cabal. 2 years is not a long time by the standards of Space Marine operations, but for a legion that specialized in preparation and intelligence work, it might have been sufficient. They would have needed to position their forces appropriately, to ensure they were assigned to operations where they could have maximum impact on the war's outcome. They would have needed to establish communication protocols with Horus's forces that allowed for coordination while maintaining operational security. And perhaps most difficult of all, they would have needed to prepare their own legionaries for what was coming, to convince warriors who had been raised to serve the emperor that betraying him was the ultimate act of loyalty. This last point deserves particular attention because it highlights one of the fundamental mysteries of the Alpha Legion's actions during the heresy. How much of the Legion actually knew the truth about the Cabal and the prophecy? It seems unlikely that every Alpha Legionary was brought into the secret. The risk of information leaking would have been too great. More likely, only the Primarchs and perhaps a select group of senior officers knew the real reason for their apparently treasonous actions. The rest of the Legion would have been given other justifications or simply ordered to follow without explanation, trusting that their Primarch had reasons for the seemingly inexplicable decision to support the arch-traitor. This creates an interesting dynamic within the Legion during the heresy. You would have had operatives who believed they were genuinely fighting for chaos, having been convinced or corrupted into accepting that cause. You would have had warriors who followed orders without understanding them, maintaining their loyalty to the Primarch, even as they questioned the wisdom of his decisions. And you would have had a very small group who knew the truth, who understood the terrible calculus that had led to this moment, and who carried that knowledge as a burden that could never be shared. The opportunity for the Alpha Legion to demonstrate their new allegiance came during what would later be known as the Dropsite Massacre of Istvan V. Horus had lured 7 loyalist legions to the Istvan system, ostensibly to bring his rebellion to an end. The story he told was that the initial betrayal had been the work of a few misguided commanders, that he himself regretted the path events had taken, and that he was prepared to stand down if the loyalist forces would accept his surrender. It was a transparent lie, but the loyalist forces had no choice but to respond. The chance to end the rebellion before it truly began was too valuable to pass up, even if the risk of a trap was obvious. And 3 of the 7 legions made the initial drop assault on the planet: the Salamanders under Vulcan, the Raven Guard under Corax, and the Iron Hands under Ferrus Manus. These were formidable forces, each legion bringing tens of thousands of Astartes and a massive array of armored vehicles, aircraft, and support elements. They struck at Horus's positions with the kind of overwhelming force that should have crushed any resistance. But Horus was ready. His forces gave ground slowly, drawing the loyalists deeper into kill zones, bleeding them without breaking. The loyalist Primarchs recognized that they were in danger of overextension and called for the second wave to reinforce their positions. The second wave consisted of 4 legions: the Iron Warriors under Perturabo, the Night Lords under Curze, the Wordbearers under Lorgar, and the Alpha Legion under Alpharius. These forces made their drop, their landing craft descending toward predetermined coordinates that would allow them to support the first wave, to trap Horus's forces between 2 anvils and crush them utterly. The loyalist forces prepared to press their advantage, confident that with reinforcements arriving, victory was within reach. And then the second wave opened fire on the first wave. The scale of the betrayal was almost incomprehensible. This wasn't a single unit turning traitor, or a breakdown in command and control. This was 4 entire Space Marine legions, possibly 100,000 Astartes or more, simultaneously turning their guns on their supposed allies. The loyalists were caught in a crossfire, as taking losses from both the enemies in front of them and what they had thought were friends behind them. The confusion was total. Individual units tried to mount organized responses, but the situation deteriorated faster than anyone could adapt to. Warriors who had trained their entire lives for combat were faced with a scenario they had never imagined: being shot in the back by other Space Marines. The Alpha Legion's participation in this massacre is well documented, though the precise details of their involvement remain characteristically unclear. They were there. They fired on the Loyalists. They killed Space Marines who had committed no crime beyond remaining faithful to the Emperor. Battle reports from surviving Raven Guard and Salamanders describe Alpha Legion units advancing with methodical precision, of firing disciplined volleys that cut down Loyalists trying to establish defensive positions. There was no hesitation, no apparent reluctance. They executed their betrayal with the same cold efficiency they brought to all their operations. But even at Istvan, the Alpha Legion's actions were not quite what they seemed. Several factors suggest that their participation in the massacre, while real, was also managed in ways that subtly undermined the traitor cause. First, there are reports from surviving loyalists that they encountered Alpha Legion units that seemed to be shooting deliberately wide, that appeared to be providing covering fire while allowing loyalist forces to escape. Second, the Alpha Legion's deployment pattern was unusual. While the other traitor legions seemed focused on maximum destruction, as on killing as many loyalists as possible, the Alpha Legion appeared to be targeting specific units and individuals while allowing others to slip through the net. Third, and perhaps most tellingly, the casualty reports from Istvan suggest that proportionally fewer loyalists died when facing Alpha Legion forces than when facing the other traitor legions. This could be explained by tactical circumstances, by the specific terrain and unit dispositions in the areas where the Alpha Legion was fighting. But it could also suggest that the Alpha Legion was deliberately moderating their fire, killing enough to maintain the appearance of full participation in the massacre, but not so many as to completely eliminate the loyalist forces. If the Cabal's prophecy was correct and humanity's extinction required Horus's victory, so perhaps complete destruction of the loyalist legions wasn't actually desirable. Perhaps some loyalists needed to survive to continue the war, to ensure that the conflict remained balanced and unpredictable. After Istvan, the Alpha Legion did not accompany Horus's other traitor forces in their march toward Terra. Instead, they were given independent operations, missions that would supposedly support the overall rebellion by tying down loyalist forces and preventing them from reinforcing the Emperor. This independent command suited the Alpha Legion perfectly. It allowed them to operate as they saw fit, without direct oversight from Horus or the other traitor Primarchs, and it created opportunities for actions that would have been impossible under closer supervision. But it also meant that the Alpha Legion's actual contributions to the traitor war effort became difficult to assess. They were fighting, certainly, but what were they fighting for? And more importantly, what were they actually accomplishing? One of the Alpha Legion's most significant operations during the heresy was their campaign against the Raven Guard. This operation reveals the kind of multi-layered thinking that characterized all Alpha Legion activities, where the apparent objective masked deeper purposes, and victory and defeat became meaningless because both outcomes advanced hidden agendas. Korax, Primarch of the Raven Guard, had managed to survive Istvan V with a fragment of his legion. The survivors numbered perhaps a few thousand Astartes out of the 80,000 or more who had started the campaign. Thus, it was a devastating blow, but Korax was not ready to give up. The Raven Guard specialized in stealth and hit-and-run tactics. Even with reduced numbers, they could still be effective. But to truly threaten the traitor cause, Korax needed to rebuild his legion's strength. Seeking a way to create new Space Marines faster than the normal process allowed, Korax embarked on a desperate gambit. He obtained access to the Emperor's own laboratories on Terra, where he discovered something of extraordinary value: the pure Primarch gene seed, the original genetic template used to create the Space Marines. This material represented decades or centuries of the Emperor's work in genetic engineering, the cumulative knowledge that had allowed him to create the Legiones Astartes in the first place. With this template, Korax believed he could accelerate the process of creating new Space Marines, reducing the time required from years to months or even weeks. If he succeeded, he could rebuild the Raven Guard to full strength and rejoin the war against Horus while the rebellion was still in its early stages. The Alpha Legion learned of Korax's plan through means that were never fully explained. Possibly they had maintained surveillance on the Raven Guard after Istvan. Possibly they had agents within the Imperial hierarchy who reported on Korax's movements. However they learned of it, they immediately recognized both the threat and the opportunity. If Korax succeeded in his plan, the strategic balance of the war would shift dramatically in the Loyalists' favor. full-strength Raven Guard Legion arriving to reinforce other loyalist forces. As could make the difference between Horus's victory and defeat. From the perspective of ensuring Horus won, as the Cabal had said was necessary, the Alpha Legion needed to stop Corax. But the operation they mounted went far beyond simple sabotage. It was characteristic of the Alpha Legion's complexity, achieving multiple objectives through a single campaign, creating outcomes that served purposes visible and hidden. First, they needed to infiltrate the Raven Guard, to place operatives inside Corax's fortress monastery, where they could access the Gene Seed project. This was an extraordinarily difficult challenge. The Raven Guard, having just survived a massacre where their fellow Space Marines had betrayed them, were hyper-vigilant about security. They were screening new recruits carefully, watching for any signs of infiltration. Yet a conventional insertion would have been nearly impossible. The Alpha Legion's solution was characteristically brutal and effective. They identified Raven Guard bodies from Istvan V, warriors who had died in the massacre but whose faces and identities were still intact. Alpha Legion apothecaries then performed sophisticated surgical procedures, grafting the facial features of these dead Raven Guard onto living Alpha Legionaries. The operations were complex, requiring not just physical alteration, but also extensive psychological conditioning to ensure the infiltrators could convincingly portray their new identities. The operatives had to learn the mannerisms, the speech patterns, the relationships and history of the Raven Guard, whose identities they were assuming. It was identity theft, at a level that required superhuman dedication and skill. These infiltrators were then inserted into Raven Guard operations in ways that made their presence seem natural. They would appear as survivors from scattered units, stragglers who had been separated during the chaos of Istvan and had only now managed to make their way back to the Legion's rally points. Their stories were carefully crafted to be plausible, with enough detail to be convincing, but not so much that discrepancies would become obvious. And crucially, they passed the various screening procedures the Raven Guard had implemented because they looked like Raven Guard. They knew things that only Raven Guard should know, and they displayed the proper psychological and genetic markers of Space Marines created from Corax's gene seed. Once in position, these infiltrators began their real mission. They identified the location and security protocols surrounding Corax's gene seed project. They transmitted this information back to their Alpha Legion handlers through encrypted channels that were designed to look like routine communications traffic. And they waited for the optimal moment to strike, the point at which they could do maximum damage to the Raven Guard's rebuilding efforts while minimizing the risk to themselves. That moment came when Corax successfully synthesized new gene seed based on the pure template he had recovered. The first batches were being prepared for implantation into a new generation of Raven Guard recruits. This was the critical juncture. If the implantation succeeded, if Corax's accelerated process worked, and then within months, he would have thousands of new Space Marines. But if something went wrong with the gene seed, if the process failed, or worse, produced flawed results, the psychological blow to Corax and his Legion would be devastating. The Alpha Legion infiltrators, acting under Omegon's direct command through a chain of communication that stretched across light years, introduced a virus-vectored mutagen into the gene seed samples. This mutagen was based on demonic essence, warp-derived material that would cause horrific mutations in anyone who received the corrupted gene seed. The corruption was subtle enough that it wouldn't be detected by standard screening. It would only become apparent after the gene seed was implanted, and the transformation process was already underway. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it would be too late to stop it. The results were exactly as the Alpha Legion had intended, and far worse than Corax could have imagined. The new recruits who received the corrupted gene seed began to transform, but not into Space Marines. They mutated into things that were barely human: sporting scales, horns, extra limbs, claws, and other demonic features. Some of the mutations were so severe that the afflicted recruits died shortly after their transformation was complete. Others survived, but were clearly damaged, physically and psychologically. They could still fight, still carry out orders, but they were monsters, rather than the proud warriors Korax had intended to create. The psychological impact on Korax was immense. He had been trying to rebuild his legion, to give his surviving warriors a chance to avenge their fallen brothers. Yet instead, he had created abominations. Warriors who had trusted him, who had volunteered to become Space Marines in service to the Emperor, had been transformed into freaks who would never be accepted in Imperial society. Korax took personal responsibility for the failure. He continued the war, continued to fight against the traitors, but something in him had broken. The guilt he felt over what had happened to his legion would haunt him for the rest of his existence. From a strategic perspective, the Alpha Legion had achieved their objective. The Raven Guard would not be returning to combat strength. They would remain a diminished force, capable of conducting small-scale operations, but unable to meaningfully affect the overall course of the war. But one of the Loyalist legions had been effectively neutralized without the Alpha Legion having to fight a single major battle against them. It was victory through subversion, through the use of methods that other legions would never have considered. But the operation had additional layers that revealed the complexity of the Alpha Legion's true agenda. The infiltrators had not just corrupted the gene seed, they had also stolen complete copies of all the data Korax had collected, all the research he had done, all the insights he had gained into the process of creating Space Marines. This data represented possibly the most valuable intelligence in the entire Imperium, knowledge that could allow rapid creation of new Astartes without the decades of experience and facilities that normally required. And the Alpha Legion had it. But when Alfarius reported the operation's success to Horus, he turned over a copy of the stolen data to the War Master. Horus was pleased, seeing this as a potential way to create more traitor Space Marines to replace the losses his forces were taking. He gave the data to Fabius Bile, the Emperor's children's chief apothecary and the foremost expert on genetic manipulation among the traitor forces. Bile began working on ways to use the information to enhance the traitor legion's capabilities. What neither Horus nor Bile knew was that the data Alfarius had provided was deliberately incomplete. Key sections were missing, crucial formulas were altered, and subtle errors had been introduced that would ensure any attempt to replicate Korax's success would fail. The Alpha Legion had kept the complete, uncorrupted data for themselves, and along with samples of both the pure gene seed and the mutagen they had used to corrupt it. This meant they possessed a capability that no other force in the galaxy had, the potential to rapidly create new Space Marines, something that could prove invaluable regardless of who ultimately won the heresy. Even more revealing was an incident that occurred during the Alpha Legion's operations in the Kondak system. The White Scars, under their Primarch Jagatai Khan, were conducting their own campaigns far from the center of the heresy. Horus sent orders to the Alpha Legion to recruit the White Scars to the traitor cause, or failing that, to destroy them. But instead of following these orders directly, the Alpha Legion engaged in a series of actions that seemed deliberately designed to inform the White Scars of Horus's treachery. Omegon, acting potentially without Alfarius's knowledge, sent forces to destroy a pylon array that had been blocking communications in the region. This array was under Alpha Legion control and was part of the original plan to keep the White Scars isolated and ignorant of the heresy until it was too late. Destroying it allowed Rogel Dawn to send a message to Jagatai Khan, warning him of Horus's betrayal. The White Scars received this warning and chose to remain loyal, but their extraction from the blockade the Alpha Legion had established was permitted through what can only be described as deliberately ineffective pursuit. This pattern of contradictory actions would repeat throughout the heresy. The Alpha Legion would undertake operations that supported the traitor cause, then would take actions that undermined those same operations, where they would fight loyalists with lethal effectiveness, then would allow critical loyalist assets to escape. They would provide intelligence to Horus, but that intelligence was often subtly flawed or incomplete. To outside observers, it seemed like the Alpha Legion was fighting a war against itself as much as it was fighting against the Imperium. The Battle of Pluto provided another example of the Alpha Legion's complex dance between loyalty and treason. As Horus's forces approached the Sol system for the final assault on Terra, the Alpha Legion conducted a surprise attack on Pluto's defensive installations. These installations, including the fortifications of the Imperial Fists, were critical to the Sol system's defenses. The Alpha Legion's attack came without warning, utilizing infiltration and precise strikes that were textbook examples of their tactical doctrine. But the attack also brought them face to face with Rogel Dawn himself. The Primarch of the Imperial Fists, the Emperor's Praetorian, was arguably one of the greatest warriors in the Imperium. The confrontation between Dawn and Alfarius ended with the apparent death of the Alpha Legion's Primarch. Dawn killed Alfarius in personal combat, driving a massive chainsword through the Primarch's head. It should have been a catastrophic blow to the Alpha Legion, the death of their Primarch before the climax of the war. But was it really Alfarius who died on Pluto? The Alpha Legion's tradition of shared identities, of operatives assuming the role and appearance of leaders, created permanent uncertainty. Dawn believed he had killed Alfarius, but Dawn had never met Alfarius before, had no way to verify the identity of the warrior he fought. It could have been Omegon in disguise. It could have been an operative who had been surgically altered and conditioned to believe he was Alfarius, creating a deception so deep that even the deceived didn't know they were playing a role. And shortly after the Battle of Pluto, Alfarius appeared at Horus's muster of traitor forces on Ulanor, providing detailed intelligence on Sol System's remaining defenses. Rather than participating in the siege of Terra itself, the Alpha Legion received orders to delay Roboute Guilliman's advance. The Ultramarines Primarch was racing to reach Terra with a massive fleet, potentially arriving in time to break the siege and save the Emperor. The Alpha Legion's mission was to prevent or at least delay this intervention, to ensure that Horus had time to confront the Emperor before reinforcements arrived. The Alpha Legion pursued this mission with characteristic effectiveness. They harassed Guilliman's fleet, forcing his ships into dangerous warp translations, picking off isolated vessels, creating delays through sabotage and misdirection. They avoided direct fleet engagement where Guilliman's numerical superiority would have told, instead using hit-and-run tactics that forced the Ultramarines to slow their advance to protect their supply lines and support vessels. The delay was sufficient. Guilliman did not arrive at Terra until after the final confrontation between Horus and the Emperor, when the outcome of the heresy had already been decided. But once again, and there are hints that the Alpha Legion's actions were not quite what they appeared. They delayed Guilliman, yes, but they did not destroy him or his fleet, though there may have been opportunities to inflict catastrophic damage. They prolonged the pursuit, but did not commit to it fully, and some accounts suggest that they sent encrypted transmissions into Guilliman's fleet, messages whose content and purpose remain unknown. Throughout all of these operations, the question that haunts every analysis is, what was the Alpha Legion actually trying to accomplish? If they were genuinely trying to ensure Horus's victory as per the Cabal's instructions, some of their actions make no sense. Allowing the White Scars to escape, sabotaging their own intelligence to Horus, failing to fully commit to operations that might have changed the war's course. And these were not the actions of a force trying to ensure a specific outcome. But if they were trying to undermine Horus, if they had abandoned the Cabal's plan and were working towards some other goal, then why participate in atrocities like Istvan V at all? The only explanation that accounts for all the contradictions is that the Alpha Legion wasn't trying to ensure either side's victory. They were trying to manage the war itself, to influence its course while keeping all options open. Perhaps they had realized that the Cabal's prophecy was false or incomplete. Perhaps they had found some hint of that third option, some way that neither of the Cabal's predicted futures had to come to pass. Or perhaps they were simply doing what they had always done, creating complexity, maintaining ambiguity, ensuring that no one, as including possibly themselves, could be entirely certain what they were really working toward. When the siege of Terra ended with the Emperor's victory, with Horus dead and the traitor forces in retreat, the Alpha Legion melted away into the void. They did not flee to the Eye of Terror with the other traitor legions. They did not make a last stand or attempt a dramatic final operation. They simply disappeared, scattered to the stellar winds, leaving behind only questions and the faint scent of ozone that might have been the after-echo of a plan whose full scope would never be understood. Shattered Legion. The long war in shadows. The end of the Horus heresy did not bring peace to the Imperium, but rather ushered in an age of sorrowful reckoning that would be called the Scouring. The traitor legions were driven into the Eye of Terror, while that vast wound in reality where the warp bled through into real space. The Loyalists counted their dead, measured their losses, and set about the grim work of ensuring such a betrayal could never happen again. Guilliman, now Lord Commander of the Imperium with the Emperor entombed upon the Golden Throne, decreed that the Space Marine legions would be broken up into smaller chapters, never again to wield the terrible power that had nearly destroyed everything they were meant to protect. For most legions, both loyalist and traitor, these prescriptions were relatively straightforward, if painful, to implement. The loyalist legions divided into chapters and spread across the Imperium. The traitor legions, confined to the Eye of Terror, and fragmented into warbands as internal conflicts and the influence of chaos eroded what cohesion they had maintained. But the Alpha Legion, as always, followed a different path. They had already scattered before the Scouring truly began, had already implemented their own version of Legion division before it was forced upon them. And what they created in the aftermath of the heresy was something unique, a distributed network of autonomous cells that maintained some measure of coordination while being nearly impossible to track or destroy. The catalyst for this final dispersion came during the Battle of Escrador. In the years following the heresy, Roboute Guilliman learned that a significant Alpha Legion force was operating in the Escrador system under the command of one of the Primarchs, Alfarius or Omegon. As accounts differ and likely neither is reliable, Guilliman led a strike force of Ultramarines to the system, determined to eliminate this traitor force and ideally to capture or kill the Alpha Legion's Primarch. What followed was a campaign that played to both legions' strengths. Guilliman deployed his Ultramarines with textbook precision, overwhelming force carefully applied according to established doctrine. The Alpha Legion responded with their characteristic misdirection and guerrilla warfare, striking from unexpected angles, melting away before they could be pinned down, eroding Guilliman's forces through attrition even as they gave ground. The campaign dragged on for days, each side inflicting casualties on the other, neither able to achieve a decisive victory. And the climax came when Guilliman finally cornered what appeared to be the Alpha Legion's Primarch. In personal combat, the Ultramarines' Primarch struck down his opposite number, killing Alfarius or Omegon, or perhaps neither. The body bore all the signs of being a Primarch, the size, the perfect features, the distinctive armor. But then again, Alpha Legionaries had always borne a striking resemblance to their Primarch, and the Alpha Legion had demonstrated countless times their willingness to sacrifice operatives in elaborate deceptions. Was the Primarch genuinely dead, or had Guilliman killed an operative conditioned and surgically altered to pass for the Primarch specifically so that Guilliman would believe the threat eliminated? Regardless of whether a Primarch actually died on Escrador, the battle had profound consequences for the Alpha Legion. Guilliman declared the campaign a victory, claimed that the Alpha Legion's leadership had been eliminated, and returned to Terra to report that the traitor force had been effectively destroyed. Imperial records would show that the Alpha Legion had been wiped out, its remnants scattered beyond any hope of reorganization. And for a legion that prized operational security and misdirection above all else, being declared dead was perhaps the greatest gift Guilliman could have given them. Following Escrador, the Alpha Legion implemented what appears to have been a long-planned contingency. Rather than trying to maintain some central command structure or holding territory that would make them a target for Imperial retaliation, they fractured completely into hundreds, perhaps thousands, of small, autonomous units. These weren't warbands in the traditional sense, groups that had broken away from central authority and were pursuing their own agendas. These were cells, trained and equipped to operate independently, but still serving what appeared to be a common purpose, or at least compatible purposes. These cells established bases throughout Imperial space and beyond. Asteroid fields where no one thought to look. Space hulks drifting through the void. Barren worlds on the fringes of Imperial territory, where oversight was minimal and interference was unlikely. From these hidden bases, the cells launched raids against Imperial targets, particularly military installations and supply depots that had been weakened or isolated during the heresy. They weren't trying to conquer territory or establish their own empire. They were simply maintaining a capability, ensuring they could strike when and where they chose. But the cells didn't just conduct military operations. Perhaps more significant in the long term was their role in spreading and coordinating chaos cults throughout the Imperium. This activity marked a notable shift in the Alpha Legion's operations. During the Great Crusade, and even during the heresy, they had been focused on military and strategic objectives. But in the wake of their defeat, or their claimed defeat, they began to invest heavily in subversion and psychological operations that worked on a timescale of decades or centuries. An Alpha Legion cell would arrive at a world and identify individuals with certain characteristics: disaffected, ambitious, idealistic, desperate, anyone who might be receptive to alternative ideologies. These individuals would be carefully cultivated, provided with resources and knowledge, shaped into the leadership of movements that opposed imperial authority. Sometimes these movements were openly chaos-worshipping cults. Sometimes they were secular rebellions with no apparent connection to the ruinous powers. Sometimes they were infiltrations of existing imperial institutions, corruptions that worked from within. The genius of this approach was that most of these cells and cults never knew they were being manipulated by the Alpha Legion. They thought they were genuinely independent movements. When they succeeded in destabilizing a world or compromising a military force, they attributed that success to their own efforts, to the favor of dark gods, or to luck. The Alpha Legion remained invisible, but a puppeteer whose strings were so subtle that the puppets didn't realize they were being controlled. These cult networks served multiple purposes. Most obviously, they created chaos and disruption throughout the Imperium, tying down military forces and creating opportunities for other traitor forces to exploit. When a major chaos incursion emerged from the Eye of Terror, it would often find that the worlds it targeted were already compromised, their defenses undermined by years or decades of Alpha Legion preparation. But the cults also served as intelligence networks, providing the Alpha Legion with information about Imperial movements and capabilities. And they acted as recruiting grounds, sources of new operatives to replace losses and expand the Legion's capabilities. This last point is crucial. Unlike other traitor legions, which were trapped in the Eye of Terror and subject to its warping effects, the Alpha Legion cells operating in real space could recruit relatively normally. They couldn't create new Space Marines from scratch. The facilities and resources required were too substantial, but they could augment promising individuals with genetic enhancements, could provide advanced training, could create operatives who, while not true Astartes, were far more capable than normal humans. This meant that the Alpha Legion's strength, rather than declining over the millennia as attrition took its toll, potentially remained constant or even grew. The fact that the Alpha Legion primarily operated outside the Eye of Terror had another significant consequence. They largely avoided the mutations and corruption that afflicted other traitor legions. Whilst the World Eaters became mindless berserkers, consumed by Khorne's rage, the Thousand Sons were reduced to animated armor filled with nothing but dust and sorcery. The Death Guard rotted with Nurgle's plagues. But the Alpha Legion, by staying in real space, by maintaining their operational discipline and avoiding prolonged exposure to the warp's corrupting influence, remained recognizably what they had been. They could still pass as loyalist Space Marines. They could still operate within Imperial society without immediately being identified as traitors. Some Alpha Legion operatives did succumb to mutation, whether from chaos influence or simple gene seed degradation over 10,000 years. But these individuals were typically isolated or eliminated. The Legion as a whole maintained remarkably high standards for what constituted an acceptable level of purity. Whether this was due to pragmatic considerations about their operational effectiveness, or whether it reflected their continued hidden loyalty to the Emperor's vision, remains a question that cannot be definitively answered. The Imperium has declared the Alpha Legion wiped out no fewer than 3 times. Once in the 31st millennium, again in the 32nd millennium, and most recently in the 39th millennium. Each time, Imperial forces conducted campaigns that supposedly eliminated the last remnants of the traitor Legion. Each time, within years or decades, Alpha Legion operations resumed. After the third declaration of extermination, some members of the Inquisition suggested that perhaps the Imperium should stop announcing the Alpha Legion's demise, since all it seemed to accomplish was proving that Imperial intelligence couldn't be trusted. This pattern of apparent destruction, followed by resurgence, supports the theory that the Alpha Legion's cellular structure was more sophisticated than anyone realized. Each cell was not just autonomous, but redundant. Multiple cells could perform similar functions, could take over for other cells that had been destroyed, could activate and deactivate as needed to create the appearance of the Legion being wiped out and then mysteriously returning. The appearance of destruction was itself a defensive tactic, convincing enemies to lower their guard, to redirect resources to other threats, to believe the problem had been solved when in fact it had merely gone underground. Notable among the Alpha Legion's post-heresy operations was their continued involvement in events that shaped the Imperium's history. They were present, in some form, at nearly every major chaos incursion. They played roles, often obscure and difficult to verify, in the Gothic War, the Badab War, and countless other conflicts. Sometimes they appeared to be supporting chaos forces. Sometimes they seemed to be opposing them. Often they were doing both simultaneously, different cells pursuing different objectives that somehow worked in concert, even though they appeared contradictory. Inquisitors who specialized in studying the Alpha Legion, and there were several who made it their life's work, had developed complex theories about what the Legion was actually trying to accomplish. Some believed they were genuinely loyal to chaos and were simply using sophisticated methods to advance its cause. Others thought they might still be loyal to the Emperor, conducting a 10,000-year covert operation whose ultimate purpose remained obscure. A few posited that the Legion had long since lost any coherent purpose and was simply continuing to operate out of institutional momentum, because operating in the shadows and creating chaos was all they knew how to do anymore. The truth, as always with the Alpha Legion, remained elusive. But one thing was clear: whatever their ultimate goal, whatever their true loyalties, they had succeeded in becoming a permanent feature of the galaxy's strategic landscape. That you couldn't destroy them because you couldn't find them. You couldn't predict them because their operations were so complex and subtle that by the time you understood what they were doing, they had already moved on to something else. They were the enemy within, the threat that could never be fully eliminated because it was embedded in the very structure of the society it threatened. And that, perhaps, was exactly what they wanted. The unanswerable questions. A Legion beyond understanding. Standing at the conclusion of this chronicle, we find ourselves no closer to understanding the Alpha Legion than when we began. Perhaps we are further from understanding, having accumulated so many contradictory facts, so many competing theories, that certainty has become impossible. This might be the greatest victory the Alpha Legion has achieved, not the destruction of their enemies, not the conquest of territory or the advancement of chaos, but simply the elimination of truth itself from any discussion of their actions and motives. The fundamental question that has haunted the Alpha Legion since the Horus Heresy is one of loyalty. Are they traitors who serve chaos, or are they loyalists conducting the longest covert operation in Imperial history? The evidence for both positions is compelling, and the evidence against both positions is equally strong. They participated in atrocities that no true loyalist could countenance, yet they consistently undermined the traitor cause in ways that no true traitor would permit. They have spent 10,000 years attacking the Imperium, yet they have also, demonstrably, protected Imperial interests on countless occasions. The Cabal's prophecy offers one possible framework for understanding this contradiction. If the Alpha Legion genuinely believed that humanity's extinction was necessary to defeat chaos, if they saw supporting Horus as the only way to serve the Emperor's ultimate goals, then their actions during the heresy make a kind of terrible sense. But the heresy ended with the Emperor's victory, the opposite outcome from what the Cabal predicted would be necessary. At that point, if the Alpha Legion was following the Cabal's plan, what were they supposed to do? Continue trying to bring about humanity's extinction? Accept that the Cabal was wrong and try to adapt to the new reality? Or pursue some third option that the Cabal had never considered? The lack of any clear answer to this question suggests that the Alpha Legion itself might not have a unified position. The existence of two Primarchs, Alpharius and Omegon, hints at the possibility of fundamental disagreement within the Legion's leadership. If the twins represented two different interpretations of the Cabal's message, two different approaches to the impossible choice they were given, then the Legion's contradictory actions might reflect genuine internal conflict rather than elaborate deception. Some evidence supports this theory. The White Scars incident, where Omegon seemingly acted to inform them of Horus's betrayal against Alpharius's apparent intentions, suggests the twins were not always in agreement. The fact that one of the Primarchs died, whether on Pluto or Escrador, or somewhere else entirely, might have resolved this disagreement by removing one of the conflicting viewpoints. But it might also have simply made the remaining Primarch's job more difficult, since he could no longer rely on his twin to manage aspects of the Legion's operations that he disagreed with but recognized as necessary. And then there is the question of whether either Primarch still lives. The Alpha Legion has always practiced shared identities, has always maintained the principle that leadership was a role rather than an individual. When a Primarch dies, or appears to die, what prevents the Legion from simply designating another operative to assume that role? With the twins' near-identical appearance to each other and to their legionaries, with the Alpha Legion's demonstrated capability for surgical alteration and psychological conditioning, creating a replacement Primarch might be entirely within their capabilities. The individual wouldn't be a real Primarch in terms of the warp-based powers and genetic enhancements, but for most purposes, that might not matter. What matters is the role, the identity, the function within the Legion's command structure. This raises the horrifying possibility that Alpharius or Omegon might be titles that have been passed down through multiple individuals over the millennia. The Primarch who met with the Cabal in 803 M30 might be long dead, but the identity lives on, maintained by the Legion as a symbol of continuity and for the psychological impact it has on both their own forces and their enemies. If true, this would mean that trying to understand the Alpha Legion's motivations by analyzing the supposed motivations of their Primarchs is fundamentally misguided, because the individuals making decisions now might have completely different perspectives from those who made decisions during the heresy. The role of chaos in the Alpha Legion's current operations is another area of profound uncertainty. Unlike the explicitly chaos-worshipping legions, the Alpha Legion has never shown wholesale dedication to any of the ruinous powers. Some warbands or cells might invoke Tzeentch, the god of schemes and manipulation, which seems like a natural fit for their methods. But other cells show no signs of chaos worship whatsoever, maintaining the kind of disciplined, secular approach to warfare that characterized the Legion during the Great Crusade. And this inconsistency might be deliberate flexibility, using chaos when it's tactically useful but not becoming dependent on it. Or it might reflect fundamental disagreements within the Legion about whether chaos should be embraced, tolerated, or opposed. The fact that Alpha Legion operatives have been documented fighting against chaos cults, sometimes even protecting Imperial forces from chaos corruption, suggests that at least some elements of the Legion see chaos as an enemy rather than an ally. But if they oppose chaos, why do they attack the Imperium? The obvious answer is that they see the Imperium itself as corrupted, as the slow decay into chaos worship that the Cabal predicted. Perhaps they believe that the current Imperium, with its religious fanaticism and its worship of the Emperor as a god, It is exactly what the Cabal warned them about. In which case, their continued operations against Imperial targets might be an attempt to undermine that corruption, to hasten the Imperium's collapse so that something better can rise from the ashes. It would be a brutal form of loyalty, destroying the Imperium to save humanity, but it would be consistent with the kind of ruthless pragmatism the Alpha Legion has always embodied. The question of coordination between Alpha Legion cells is perhaps the most technically fascinating mystery. How do cells that operate independently, that might go decades or centuries without contact with other elements of the Legion, maintain any kind of unified purpose? There must be some mechanism for communication, some way to share intelligence and coordinate operations. But conventional communication methods would be vulnerable to Imperial interception. The Alpha Legion must have developed something more sophisticated, perhaps involving dead drops in specific locations, perhaps utilizing the warp in ways that don't require psychers and aren't subject to normal warp communication vulnerabilities. Or perhaps there is no central coordination, and what appears to be unified purpose is actually something more emergent. If every cell follows the same basic principles, operates according to the same doctrine, pursues similar objectives using similar methods, then their operations would naturally complement each other even without explicit coordination. It would be like a distributed intelligence, each component acting independently but contributing to an overall pattern that serves common goals. This would make the Alpha Legion almost impossible to destroy because there would be no central node to eliminate, no leadership to decapitate. Every cell would be capable of continuing the mission indefinitely, even if every other cell was destroyed. In the current era, in the grim darkness of the 41st and 42nd millennia, the Alpha Legion remains as enigmatic as ever. They emerge from the shadows to strike at targets both Imperial and Chaos, their motives unclear, their ultimate goals indecipherable. Sometimes they appear as saviors, their interventions protecting Imperial worlds from threats that weren't even recognized until after the Alpha Legion had already dealt with them. Sometimes they are destroyers, their operations leaving nothing but chaos and ruin in their wake. But the modern Alpha Legion operates through a network of autonomous cells that spans the entire galaxy. These cells vary dramatically in size and capability. Some consist of just a handful of full Astartes, supported by a larger group of human operatives and augmented agents. Others are substantial forces numbering hundreds of space marines with extensive fleets and equipment. The larger cells are sometimes called warbands, a term that applies to most Chaos Space Marine forces, but this terminology can be misleading. A warband implies a group that has broken away from central authority and operates independently for its own benefit. Alpha Legion cells, despite their autonomy, still appear to be working toward coordinated objectives, even when those objectives aren't immediately apparent. But communication between cells is one of the great mysteries of the modern Alpha Legion. How do groups that might be separated by thousands of light years, that might go decades, without any contact with other elements of the Legion, maintain any kind of strategic coherence? There must be some system for passing information, some way for cells to coordinate their operations when such coordination would be beneficial. But conventional communication methods would be vulnerable to Imperial interception, particularly given the Inquisition's obsessive focus on identifying and eliminating Alpha Legion activity. One theory suggests the use of a distributed network of dead drops, locations scattered throughout the galaxy where information can be left for other cells to retrieve. These locations would need to be obscure enough that they wouldn't be stumbled upon by chance, but predictable enough that Alpha Legion operatives would know to check them. Abandoned space stations, specific asteroids, derelict ships floating in the void, all could serve this purpose. A cell completing an operation might leave a detailed after-action report at such a location, encoded in ways that only other Alpha Legion forces could decrypt. Months or years later, another cell passing through the region might retrieve this information and use it to inform their own operations. Another possibility involves the use of human agents operating in plain sight within Imperial society. These individuals might not even know they're part of the Alpha Legion's network. They could be merchants who travel between systems carrying data storage devices they believe contain commercial records, but actually hold encrypted intelligence. They could be Imperial officials whose routine reports contain steganographic messages visible only to those who know what patterns to look for. The advantage of such an approach is that even if individual agents are compromised or killed, the network as a whole would remain intact because no single agent would know enough to betray the entire system. A more exotic theory, whispered among inquisitors who specialize in hunting the Alpha Legion, suggests warp-based communication that doesn't rely on psychers or traditional astropathic methods. The Alpha Legion might have discovered or developed techniques for impressing information onto the fabric of the warp itself, or creating markers or beacons that could be detected by those with the right equipment or training. Such a system would be nearly impossible for Imperial forces to intercept because it wouldn't look like communication in any conventional sense. It would just be another ripple in the constantly churning sea of warp energy that surrounds all of real space. Regardless of how they communicate, the fact remains that Alpha Legion cells demonstrate a remarkable ability to operate in concert even when separated by vast distances. This coordination becomes evident when examining their operations over extended periods. A cult uprising on one side of the Imperium might seem unrelated to a military strike on the other side, but closer analysis reveals that the two events serve complementary strategic purposes. The uprising draws Imperial forces away from key positions, while the military strike exploits the gaps in coverage those redeployments create. Neither operation would be particularly effective on its own, but together they create a synergy that suggests deliberate planning. Some of their most significant recent operations include the Ghost Legion's emergence in M42. This was a coalition of Alpha Legion warbands under the command of Harrow Master Solomon Akura, a figure whose name had appeared in Imperial intelligence reports for over a century. The Ghost Legion represented one of the most organized and overtly aggressive Alpha Legion operations in recent millennia. Rather than operating from the shadows and avoiding direct confrontation, Akura gathered multiple warbands under his banner and began openly challenging Imperial control of entire sectors. The campaign began with the simultaneous seizure of 3 strategically important worlds in the Vigilus system. These worlds controlled critical shipping lanes and served as supply depots for Imperial Navy operations in the region. Their loss didn't just deny the Imperium access to resources, it created a gap in the network of fortified positions that formed the Imperium's defensive perimeter. Other hostile forces, sensing weakness, began probing the region, creating a cascading crisis that required the diversion of substantial military assets to contain. But even as the Ghost Legion was conducting these apparently conventional military operations, they were simultaneously running dozens of covert operations throughout the same region. Cult cells that had been dormant for years or decades suddenly activated, launching coordinated uprisings that stretched Imperial garrison forces thin. Supply convoys were ambushed not by the Ghost Legion directly, but by what appeared to be unaffiliated pirate or renegade groups that just happened to strike at the exact moments when convoys were most vulnerable. Imperial command structures were compromised by infiltrators whose loyalty had been subverted years earlier, causing critical delays in response times and the diversion of forces to false threats. The scale of the operation was impressive, but what made it particularly notable was how it was eventually defeated. Imperial forces did manage to retake the captured worlds and scatter the Ghost Legion's warbands. Harrow Master Akura was supposedly killed in the final battle, his command ship destroyed with all hands. But the circumstances of the defeat raise questions about whether it was genuinely a defeat at all. The Imperial counteroffensive succeeded far more easily than it should have, given the strength of the forces the Ghost Legion had assembled. Key defensive positions were abandoned without a fight. Akura's command ship was destroyed, but there were never any confirmed visual sightings of Akura himself during the entire campaign. And intelligence recovered from captured Alpha Legion positions, while superficially valuable, proved to be frustratingly vague or outdated when analyzed closely. It's possible, perhaps even probable, that the entire Ghost Legion campaign was never intended to result in permanent territorial gains. Instead, it might have been a large-scale diversion, drawing Imperial attention and resources to one region, while other Alpha Legion operations proceeded unmolested elsewhere. The defeat of the Ghost Legion then becomes part of the plan, a way to convince Imperial authorities that the threat had been neutralized when in fact the real objectives had already been achieved. Akura might be alive, operating under a different identity, or his identity might have always been a fiction, a name and persona assumed by multiple Alpha Legion commanders for the purposes of this particular operation. The return of Robute Guilliman in the modern era has added another layer of complexity to the Alpha Legion's operations. Here Guilliman is one of the few beings alive who has first-hand experience fighting against the Alpha Legion during the heresy and its immediate aftermath. He was the one who supposedly killed one of their Primarchs at Escrador, though whether that killing was real or another Alpha Legion deception remains uncertain. Now, as Lord Commander of the Imperium, Guilliman has access to resources and authority that allow him to prioritize the hunt for the Alpha Legion in ways that would have been impossible during the chaos of the heresy. But Guilliman also brings predictability. He is a logical, methodical commander who operates according to established principles. While he's capable of adaptation and strategic creativity, his approach to warfare follows patterns that can be analyzed and anticipated. If the Alpha Legion has indeed maintained institutional memory of how Guilliman thinks and operates, they have a significant advantage. They know what he's likely to prioritize, what he'll consider acceptable risks, and what scenarios he'll try to avoid. This knowledge allows them to create situations that present Guilliman with choices where all options benefit the Alpha Legion in some way. For example, there have been several incidents since Guilliman's return where Imperial forces have received intelligence about Alpha Legion operations that seems too good to be true. The intelligence is detailed, specific, and actionable. It identifies locations, timing, and objectives of supposed Alpha Legion activities. When Imperial forces act on this intelligence, they do indeed find Alpha Legion operatives or assets at the indicated locations. Battles are fought, casualties are taken on both sides, and the Imperial forces usually achieve tactical victories. But these victories raise questions. Why would the Alpha Legion allow their operations to be discovered? Why would they continue operating in patterns that Imperial forces can predict and counter? One possibility is that these are genuine intelligence failures on the Alpha Legion's part, that even their vaunted operational security has weaknesses that can be exploited. But another possibility, one that keeps Inquisitors awake at night, is that these are controlled burns. The Alpha Legion might be deliberately sacrificing minor operations and expendable cells in order to feed the Imperium intelligence that seems valuable but actually distracts from more important activities. Consider what happens when Imperial forces successfully disrupt an Alpha Legion operation based on intelligence that seems suspiciously convenient. Resources are committed to the operation, forces are deployed to specific locations, and attention is focused on particular threats. All of this represents opportunity cost. Those resources, forces, and attention cannot simultaneously be directed elsewhere. If the Alpha Legion's real operation is happening somewhere completely different, using methods that don't match the patterns Imperial forces have been trained to recognize, then the successful disruption of a minor operation actually contributes to the success of a major one. The Alpha Legion's relationships with other Chaos forces in the modern era are complex and often contradictory, unlike the Word-Bearers, who are genuinely devoted to Chaos worship, or the World Eaters, who have become little more than berserker slaves to Khorne. The Alpha Legion maintains a flexible approach to the ruinous powers. Some cells do invoke Chaos gods, particularly Tzeentch, whose association with schemes and manipulation makes him a natural patron for Alpha Legion methods. But other cells show no signs of Chaos worship whatsoever, operating with a secular focus that would not be out of place in a Loyalist chapter. This flexibility extends to their interactions with other traitor forces. The Alpha Legion has been documented fighting alongside Black Legion forces in some campaigns, while actively working against them in others. They've provided intelligence and support to Death Guard plague fleets, yet then turned around and tipped off Imperial forces about Death Guard movements in other sectors. They've infiltrated Emperor's Children warbands, Night Lords raiding parties, and Iron Warriors siege armies, sometimes supporting these forces and sometimes undermining them in ways that only become apparent months or years after the fact. These contradictory relationships suggest that the Alpha Legion sees other Chaos forces as tools to be used rather than allies to be supported. If a particular Chaos incursion serves Alpha Legion objectives, they'll support it. If it doesn't, they'll work against it, or they'll do both simultaneously, supporting elements of the incursion that serve their purposes while undermining elements that don't. This approach has earned them the suspicion and enmity of other traitor legions, but it also makes them unpredictable in ways that even other Chaos forces find frustrating. There have been multiple documented cases of Alpha Legion forces operating within Imperial space without being immediately identified as enemies. The most notorious of these are instances where Alpha Legion operatives have successfully posed as loyalist space marines for extended periods. They adopt the colors and heraldry of loyalist chapters, sometimes even taking on specific identities of individual space marines who have been killed in action. With the Alpha Legion's characteristic attention to detail, these impostures can be maintained for years. The implications of such infiltration are terrifying. If Alpha Legion operatives can pass as loyalist space marines, they can access secure facilities, participate in strategic planning sessions, and position themselves to sabotage critical operations. They can also gather intelligence about loyalist force dispositions, capabilities, and intentions. And perhaps most insidiously, they can sow distrust within loyalist chapters. When an Alpha Legion infiltration is eventually discovered, it raises questions about whether there are other infiltrators who haven't been found. It makes Space Marines suspicious of their own brothers, creates paranoia that can be as damaging as actual betrayal. The Inquisition has established specialized cells dedicated solely to identifying and eliminating Alpha Legion threats. These Inquisitors develop extensive expertise in Alpha Legion tactics and methods, study every scrap of intelligence about the traitor Legion, and dedicate their lives to the pursuit of this particular enemy. But the track record of these specialists is mixed at best. For every Alpha Legion cell they successfully identify and destroy, they seem to miss several others. And there's always the nagging concern that apparent successes might actually be defeats, that what looks like the destruction of an Alpha Legion cell might actually be exactly what the Alpha Legion wanted to happen. One of the most famous anti-Alpha Legion specialists was Inquisitor Kravin of the Ordo Malleus. Over the course of decades, Kravin assembled what was considered the most comprehensive collection of intelligence about the Alpha Legion in Imperial possession. He developed theories about their command structure, their communication methods, and their ultimate objectives. He led operations that resulted in the capture or killing of dozens of Alpha Legion operatives. He was considered the Imperium's foremost expert on the 20th Legion. And then it was discovered that Kravin himself had been compromised. Whether through blackmail, ideological conversion, or some more subtle form of corruption, Kravin had been feeding misinformation into his own intelligence assessments for years. Much of what the Imperium knew about the Alpha Legion, information that had come through Kravin's investigations, was false or deliberately misleading. Operations had been planned based on this false intelligence, resulting in wasted resources and missed opportunities to strike at actual Alpha Legion operations. Kravin disappeared shortly after this was discovered, and his current whereabouts are unknown. Whether he was always an Alpha Legion agent, or whether he was turned at some point during his investigations, remains unclear. The Kravin incident illustrates one of the fundamental challenges in combating the Alpha Legion. They don't just operate in physical space, conducting military operations and espionage. They operate in information space, manipulating what people know and believe in ways that turn apparent knowledge into a liability. Every piece of intelligence about them is suspect. Every successful operation against them might be a deception. Every expert who claims to understand them might be compromised. It creates a situation where the more you think you know about the Alpha Legion, the less you might actually understand. In recent years, Oh, there have been persistent rumors of Alpha Legion forces actively fighting against Chaos corruption in some regions. These reports describe Space Marines in Alpha Legion colors intervening to stop demonic incursions, eliminating Chaos cult leadership, and generally acting as if they were loyalist forces. The Inquisition has been unable to confirm most of these reports, and those that have been confirmed are difficult to interpret. Were these genuinely loyalist actions, or were the Alpha Legion eliminating competition, clearing out Chaos forces that were interfering with their own operations? Was it a calculated attempt to sow confusion about their true allegiance, or evidence that some elements of the Legion really do still serve the Emperor in their own twisted way? The question of whether any part of the Alpha Legion remains loyal to the Imperium is perhaps the most controversial topic in all discussions of the traitor legions. Most authorities flatly dismiss the possibility. The Alpha Legion participated in the Horus heresy on the side of the traitors. They killed loyalist Space Marines at Istvan. They have spent 10,000 years attacking Imperial targets. Whatever their original motivation might have been, whatever complicated reasoning led them to betray the Emperor, they are traitors now and must be treated as such. But a minority of scholars and inquisitors maintain that the question is more complex. They point to the contradictions in Alpha Legion behavior, the way their operations sometimes seem to serve Imperial interests, even as they're ostensibly working against the Imperium. And they note that the Alpha Legion has been remarkably consistent in avoiding certain targets, that they've never, for example, made a serious attempt to attack Terra or to capture critical worlds like Cadia before its fall. They observe that while the Alpha Legion spreads Chaos cults, those cults often seem to draw attention and resources from more genuinely dangerous Chaos movements, as if the Alpha Legion-backed cults are meant to be discovered and destroyed, sacrificial pawns in a larger game. These scholars propose that the Alpha Legion might still be following the Cabal's plan in some form, that they've spent 10,000 years trying to bring about humanity's extinction as the only way to defeat Chaos. Alternatively, they might have rejected the Cabal's plan, but decided that the best way to serve the Emperor's ultimate goals is to work from within Chaos, undermining it from the inside while maintaining the appearance of serving it. Or perhaps there's a split within the Legion, with some cells genuinely loyal to the Emperor while others have embraced Chaos, and the contradictory behaviors are the result of these factions working at cross purposes. The truth, as with everything involving the Alpha Legion, remains frustratingly elusive. What is clear is that in the modern era, they remain one of the most significant threats to Imperial stability, not because of the raw military power they wield, but because of the uncertainty and paranoia they create. Every rebellion might be backed by the Alpha Legion. Every traitor might be one of their agents. Plus, every defeat of their forces might be part of a plan whose true purpose won't become apparent for decades. They are the enemy that cannot be pinned down, cannot be predicted, and cannot be eliminated because they exist as much as an idea as they do as a physical force. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where certainty is a luxury few can afford, the Alpha Legion's greatest weapon remains the simple fact that no one knows what they're really trying to accomplish. What we can say with certainty is that the Alpha Legion remains a significant factor in the galaxy's fate. They are active on countless worlds, operating through thousands of cells and uncounted human operatives. Their influence touches events from the lowliest agri-world rebellion to the highest levels of imperial governance. They are simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, a force that shapes history while remaining invisible to those they influence. And perhaps that's exactly how they want it. Because if no one can understand them, no one can predict them. If no one can predict them, no one can counter them. If no one can counter them, they maintain freedom of action that no other force in the galaxy possesses. The uncertainty that surrounds the Alpha Legion is not a flaw in their operational security, but the most powerful weapon in their arsenal. As long as questions remain unanswered, as long as their true nature remains hidden, they cannot be defeated, because defeating them requires understanding them. and understanding them has proved impossible for 10,000 years. In the end, the Alpha Legion is less a military force than they are a concept, an idea that has taken on institutional form. They are the uncertainty principle applied to warfare, the darkness between the stars given purpose and intelligence. They are every suspicion that things are not as they seem, every paranoid fantasy about hidden manipulators, made real through 10 millennia of continuous operation. They are the enemy that is always one step ahead, because they were there before you arrived, shaping the situation before you even knew there was a situation to shape. The Emperor created 20 Space Marine legions to conquer the galaxy and bring humanity together under his rule. 19 of those legions, for good or ill, served their purpose with varying degrees of success and loyalty. But the 20th Legion was always different. They were not conquerors but shadows, not warriors but manipulators, not servants but something else entirely, something that defies easy categorization. And now, 10,000 years later, while other legions have either fallen to ruin or ossified into parodies of their former glory, the Alpha Legion continues to adapt, to evolve, to remain relevant in ways that their creators might never have intended. The saga of the Alpha Legion is ultimately a story about the limits of knowledge. It is a demonstration that even in a universe where gods walk among mortals and the impossible happens daily, some things remain fundamentally unknowable. Not because the information doesn't exist, but because the information itself is part of a deception so comprehensive that separating truth from fiction becomes meaningless. The Alpha Legion doesn't just keep secrets. They are secrets, reality-warping enigmas wrapped in power armor, pursuing goals that might be noble or monstrous, or both, or neither. And so we return to where we began, standing at the threshold of mystery, no wiser than when we started. The Alpha Legion remains the most mysterious force in Warhammer 40k, not because we lack information, but because the information we have refuses to resolve into anything approaching understanding. They are the question that answers itself by demonstrating that the question was wrong to begin with. They are the 20th Legion, the last to be found, and perhaps the most dangerous of all, not because of what they do, but because of what they represent. The possibility that the foundations of everything we think we know are built on carefully maintained illusions, and the reality beneath is something we might not want to see. I am Alfarius. You are Alfarius. We are all Alfarius. And that is the only truth the Alpha Legion has ever offered us. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the Alpha Legion. If you enjoyed unraveling these mysteries with me, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more explorations of Warhammer 40k's most fascinating factions. The galaxy is vast and dark, and there are always more shadows to explore. Until next time, may your secrets remain hidden and your enemies remain confused about your true intentions. Hydra Dominatus.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.